Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Working Families webinar. I'm Jane Fonsale I'm the CEO of Working Families, just forgetting my title there. And I'd like to welcome you to National Work-Life Week 2022. And this week, we're focusing on how to increase access to flexible working and find the flex in every role. Our discussion today fits very, very nicely into that theme. Please join the conversation on social media with the hashtag #WorkLifeWeek. A bit about Working Families. We're the UK's national charity for working parents and carers. Our mission is to remove the barriers that working parents and carers face in the workplace. We do this in three key ways: by empowering working parents and carers through our free legal advice service, by supporting employers to improve their flexible and family-friendly practices, and by driving legislative change by influencing policymakers. And that's as hard to say as it is to do. We're delighted to welcome you to our Working Families Flex for Fathers webinar in partnership with our friends at SF Recruitment. And we've got an absolutely fantastic panel here today. And it's going to be led by Mike Latimer, who's the Managing Director at SF Recruitment, who's our National Work Life sponsor. Thank you very much for joining us, Mike, and for all of your support this week, and not just you, but also your colleagues. Dr Jasmine Kelland, who is the Lecturer in Human Resources Management at the University of Plymouth's Business School. And I need to say a personal thank you to Jasmine. My godson was in one of her classes, and so I suddenly became really popular because of that. Thank you. Then Lieutenant Colonel Tony Frank, who's Personnel Director at the British Army. And we are hoping that we will have another guest joining us, but he was supposed to be coming from Australia. And that does seem to be a bit of a problem. Things aren't going quite well underneath that sea cable. Most importantly, you're not going to be hearing from me the whole time, which is always a good thing. I'm completely delighted to be joined by our moderator, Elliott Rae, who's founder and editor-in-chief of Music Football Fatherhood, and who the BBC, no less, has nicknamed the dad's version of Mumsnet. I know he wishes he had their income. Elliott will kindly be chairing our discussion today and putting some questions to our panel. And before we jump into the panel discussion, Dr. Kelland's going to share some of her fascinating findings from her new book. Now, before we do that, we actually had a poll to have while everyone was joining us. And I'm not entirely sure where the poll is. Oh, there it is. Okay, so you can do this live. And it's going to be very interesting to see what these numbers are. And the question, of course, is, do you feel that your organisation does enough to support fathers? Yeah, unsurprisingly, at the moment, it looks like we could do more. So I'm delighted that you are all here, because, of course, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about, is how you can do more. So we're going to stop sharing that poll now. And as I said, before we jump into the discussion, Dr. Kelland is going to share some of her fascinating findings from her new book that has taken a deep dive into the forfeits faced by many fathers who want to balance their careers with a more equitable share of family care, but often feel held back by traditional stereotypes. If you have any questions, please, please, please type them into the Q&A box. And once Dr. Kelland and the rest of the panel have spoken, Elliott is going to get to as many of those questions as he can in the second half of the webinar. And hey, I'm delighted to say that Martin has been able to join us
Hello,
all
buddy.
the way from Australia. I can just see Martin's face. So Martin is the executive sponsor for the Families Network at Amex. So welcome, Martin. Jasmine's going to lead with her presentation. Then Elliott is going to moderate the questions, and we'll put them to you in a particular order, but he'll let you know that. So, yep, welcome everybody. And Jasmine, thank you. Over to you.
Wonderful. So can you see my slides? Are they there?
Slides there? Okay, I'll presume they are. Let me know if they're not. I'm delighted to be talking to you today, so thank you for having me. Particularly, I'm sort of sharing the highlights from my book, which focuses on caregiving fathers in the workplace and their experiences, which I've sort of termed as the Fatherhood Forfeit, and I'm going to go through some detail with you about what that looks like and also why it matters and how we can try to reduce it. Just before we sort of start, I think it's probably quite relevant to explain how I kind of found myself talking about these issues. This is came out of my PhD research largely. And when you start on a project such as a PhD, it's quite vast. And so one of the things that you want to think about is what you're really sort of interested in and what you're really fascinated to find more about. And this was a topic that I was really quite interested in. One of the reasons for that was my own sort of experiences with my family and what was happening at the time. I have 3 daughters and I've worked pretty much full time all of that time, which has required quite a lot of flexibility from both myself and my husband. And some of the challenges around that have been in him obtaining flexibility. And he's faced quite a lot of challenges over the years, to be honest, when the girls have needed various things and needed to be collected from various points. It's always been quite challenging. And sort of these sort of comments here, what the belief is your miss is doing all the time, why do you have to get the kids, why doesn't she just do it, was quite typical for sort of family life for us when the girls were small. And so when I was looking at doing a PhD and exploring something in this depth, I wanted to look at something that really interested me and really sort of captivated me, and I wanted to find out more about it. So I was keen to explore if other families faced difficulties in this area and also what the impact of that was, because certainly for the impact for us was that in the main it was kind of easier if I went and if I picked up the children, because it was easier for me to get time off, it was easier for me to undertake that. So I was interested to explore in more detail if other people had that experience. So what I did is I spoke to a lot of managers, I spoke to working parents, both mums and dads, and HR managers, to explore what their experiences was of being a caregiving father, of maybe wanting to be a caregiving father but feeling that they weren't able to do that, and also to talk to HR managers. And I did that through interviews, I did that through focus groups with managers, and also I did that through a survey. And what I asked the participants to do during the survey was I asked them to rate fictitious candidates, and I had applicants who were part-time mums and dads and applicants who were full-time mums and dads. And so I had a number of different types of data to be able to give me a really good understanding of what was happening with fathers and how fathers were viewed in the workplace. So out of this kind of emerged something that I've called the Fatherhood Forfeit, and I felt that caregiving fathers had faced sort of 4 main forfeits when they wanted to be actively involved in the care of their children. And what I wanted to do now is just kind of illustrate some examples of those. The first element relates to the quantitative data, so through the survey, and that's kind of mainly what it pertains to. And what I was found there was that fathers were less likely to obtain a job that allows for caregiving due to scoring lower during the selection process. And that was through the example that I mentioned before, where I asked them to rate fictitious candidates. I found that the caregiving fathers consistently and significantly scored less than the other options. So the other options were your part-time mum and a full-time working mum and a full-time working dad, and they scored lower on issues such as hireability and promotability, those sort of factors. So that was the sort of first element of the Fatherhood Forfeit. And the other elements came out of the focus groups and of the interviews. And there's sort of 3 elements that I wanted to explain to you. The first being secondary status. So fathers feeling that they always had secondary status, regardless of the circumstances of their family. Fathers feeling that they have got less workplace support for caregiving. And this view was also held by the managers as well, and also supported by the mothers. And actually an element of social mistreatment, where caregiving fathers were found to face social mistreatment in a number of different ways. And I want to sort of illustrate to you some examples of that. So when it comes to secondary status, one of the things that I often referred to in the book is something that I've called think child, think mum. Often for employers, when people think about a child, they associate that with the mum automatically. And a lot of these comments weren't made with malice, they weren't intended to cause upset, but as they were received, they had an impact on those caregiving fathers. So one of the sort of themes within this notion of secondary status was that it was regardless of the working hours of the parents. So even if the mother was working full-time and the father was working part-time, or was a full-time stay-at-home dad, they still were facing this sort of these judgments of secondary status. There was a real sense that dads can't cope and dads aren't quite as good as mum. And the example that I've given here for Bill was he was saying that he goes to the play school and all the mothers almost try to mother his daughter. And he was saying they might sort of fix their hair, they might remind him of school events, and they'll say things to him such as, don't forget the wellies on Tuesday, that sort of thing. And he felt quite strongly that they wouldn't say that if his wife was there. And there's that kind of impression that he can't cope and is not quite as good as the mum. The other thing that came up a lot in the interviews was this idea of where is mum, and the actual phrase was said to me so many times that I made it quite a focus of the book, where fathers were saying when they go to events with their children, whatever that might be, they're normally met with the question of where's mum, couldn't mum make it today? And he sort of said, particularly Corey in this example, said, I'm sure people are just making conversation, but it made him feel quite awkward. It made him feel quite secondary. And actually, he wasn't quite as good as the mum, and he had to explain. And some of the fathers felt they had to almost defend their wives because there was an assumption that the wife should have been there and why weren't they there? The second element of the fatherhood forfeit that came out of the interviews and the focus groups was that there was less support for caregiving. And this came from the dads themselves, the mums, and also the managers. And the two quotes I've given here are actually from managers, where Sophie, who was a manager, said that a father would be looked at differently than a mum, and perhaps it's easier for people to understand a mum taking time off, and they're going to be more supportive to a mum than they would be a dad. The other element of less workplace support I've called subject to negotiation. It felt that it was quite conditional, and that some of the managers in the survey, in the interviews, talked about fathers almost being waiting to be given permission, and they felt it was much more of a negotiation. They felt they needed to make more of a story about it, whereas, for example, in the workplace, if a mother said that she needed to leave because there was a child that was sick, that would be okay. Whereas some of the fathers were talking about examples where they would need to leave to pick up a child, and they had to really establish the unavailability of everybody else in their family. So they would be asked, why can't your wife do it? Why can't your mum do it? Can her mum do it? Can the nursery have it? Can the childminders have it? And only eventually, after that period of negotiation, would they be able to leave, which is quite shocking, I think, particularly given the setup of some people's families, that actually both parents were working sort of reduced hours, or both parents working full time. The final element of the fatherhood forfeit that I wanted to share with you has sort of a number of different sort of sub-themes, really. I'm looking at sort of fathers feeling that they were viewed as idle, and that actually when they wanted to spend and to work less or to be more actively involved in caregiving, it was construed by many as almost being work shy, and that it was about avoiding full-time work and breadwinner mentalities rather than a genuine desire to spend more time with their family. An example here from Nicola, who was a full-time working mum. She said, I know it works for some families, but every time I see them, and she was talking about stay-at-home dads, I just think, go to work, you lazy beep. It wouldn't work for my house, which is quite a shocking example, really, of how sometimes caregiving fathers are viewed. The other thing that came up quite often in the interviews was this idea of mockery. And here I've got an example of where a manager was saying that actually there would be quite a lot of teasing for a father who wanted to work reduced hours or take flexibility to spend more time with their family. He talks about there would be a lot of piss taking. You're a bit of a wuss. She rules the roost, wears the trousers, that sort of thing. There would be a lot of, you're not a real man. What's wrong with your wife? And I think it's most telling almost in this last line. It would be gentle, but it would definitely occur. I don't know about you, but I don't really think that that's gentle. I would find that really hard if someone was saying those sort of things to me. And I think it sort of shows the extent of some of the challenges that some caregiving fathers do face in the workplace. Some of the other more general things that came up was the view of suspicion, where fathers were saying they do feel that they're judged quite suspiciously when they want to take an active role in caregiving. They face more generally negative judgment, and they're concerned about negative judgment, with some dads saying that they would like to reduce their hours or work more flexibly, but were too concerned about the negative judgment to do that. And as a more sort of general point, it came up quite often in the interviews that fathers were saying that they did feel they struggled with friendships when they moved away from the more sort of traditional full-time working and breadwinner mentalities. They felt that they did struggle with friendships and they felt quite excluded. So there's some quite sort of powerful, I think, narratives in this data. And I think it's useful just to sort of stop at this point really and think about why this matters. Naturally, the experience has been really quite traumatic for some of the caregiving fathers that we've spoke about, but I think it's really important to think, why does it actually sort of matter? And I think why it matters, and hopefully I've illustrated that, but why it matters is that this is very much about gender inequality. It's not only about the dads and the experiences, which for some were very traumatic, to be quite honest with you, but actually it's about gender inequality for both mums and dads. These sort of attitudes and fatherhood forfeits often will force mothers to remain in part-time work and fathers to continue in full-time work, which might not be best for their family. It might not be what they want to do, and it might put undue pressure onto the mother within that family. It kind of reinforces some of the full-time breadwinning norms around men, and then part-time female homemaker models for women, which actually has significant impacts with the gender pay gap. As we're all well aware, gender pay gap, the gap is not that large when people first graduate in their 20s, but it gets higher and higher, and around the age people are having children, it really gets quite significant, and it's quite hard for women to recover. So addressing this is a key sort of organisational priority in my view. Also, more generally, involved fathers have improved family outcomes, and there's a huge amount of research in this area, and lots of academics in this research have done research in this area can demonstrate that. And more generally, with a sort of business hat on, I think we can all sort of be confident that people who have the right work-life balance, they want to join your company, they want to stay in your company, and they work harder when they're there. So there's a real sort of business benefits to addressing some of these issues. So some recommendations before we go into the panel discussion that I've kind of pulled out. The last chapter of the book talks about some recommendations for reducing the fatherhood forfeit, and how I came across them was through what the HR managers were saying to me when I was interviewing them, and also I interviewed a number of organisations who've been really successful in this area and who have won sort of best practice awards in this area about what they've done, and that's how I've kind of compiled some of these sort of key recommendations for reducing fatherhood forfeits in the organisation. The first one is about equalising organisational policy and leave arrangements for parents, making sure that they are gender neutral and that it's clear that they are able to be accessed by both men and women in their organisation, and to actively encourage them to do that, and to when people do access them, to tell people about it, to make it really clear what they've done and to promote that. Management training is also something that is key, particularly looking at management of flexible working requests from fathers and how to support them, and making sure that your management teams are actively encouraging that and are being really positive about that. Considering advertising all roles as flexible from the outset is key to this, making sure that wherever possible your advertising roles is flexible, so that we need to move away from this kind of complex network of favours and sort of, is it all right if I leave, and asking and requesting. Actually, can we advertise roles as flexible from the outset? If that's possible, why don't we do that? That might be a good option for us. Looking at the role of banter, I think, is also critical. A lot of the comments that were made and that were repeated to me in the interviews weren't meant to be intentionally hurtful. They weren't meant to make people feel the way that they felt. So looking at sort of really zero tolerance for this sort of level of banter and clamping down on that is key to that. If you hear something, if you hear some of the elements of social mistreatment, if you hear mockery, challenge that and query that, and so that you can try in your organisations to change the culture around that. Other things that organisations have done that have been really successful is to establish mentoring schemes for fathers and fatherhood forums, to give them a way to get support within the organisation and to be more confident in their role, and to be able to ask and feel more happy and satisfied to be able to ask for any flexible working that they might want. And also as a point of contact to talk to other people about what's available in their organisation and to support them through that process. And the last thing that I wanted to mention was the importance of reviewing unconscious bias training. And I think this is quite a quick win, really. And a good way of tackling this is to look at your unconscious bias training is there a way that you can add discrimination for caregiving fathers to your unconscious bias training? And that's something that I've been working most recently with a number of organisations, just to add a bit of detail that they can add to their unconscious bias training packages, so that you can encompass this as one of your areas of focus. And that's all that I wanted to say really today before we go into the panel discussion. But as you would expect, there's the link to the book should you want to purchase it. If you are thinking that you want to make any changes to your policy with regards to caregiving fathers and addressing the fatherhood forfeit, I'm always happy to have a chat with you. And so my email address will be there. So I'm always happy to have a chat with you about that. So thank you. Over to you, Elliott, I think.
So just for me to say thank you so much, Jasmine, for sharing those insights with us. You know, on my script, it says, I'm sure there will be some questions. I know there are going to be tons and tons of questions about this at the end of, you know, this amazing research. I know that so much of what you've said will resonate with Elliott. And I'm going to hand over to Elliott, who's some questions for the panel. Thank you so much, Elliott, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you, Jasmine. Amazing research there. Really, really powerful. You may have seen in the advertising that I was referred to as a dad guru. Now I'm going to take that for the purposes of the event, but I'm sure if you ask my daughter, she would have other things to say about that. But my name is Elliott Rae. I host and run an organization called Music Football Fatherhood, and I also work with organizations as well. And my work is all about open conversations about being a dad. And what I'm finding in the community events that we're doing is that a lot of fathers now are talking about balance. They are talking about the tensions of expectation, and they are talking about how they can have that career, but also be a fully involved and equal parent at home. And I think some of the things that Jasmine mentioned in her research really, really hits home to me personally, and a lot of the dads that I speak to on a day-to-day basis. Now, this work is so important. It is so critical. It's so important to children and the outcomes that children experience, and them having healthy, active parents at home. It can be the difference between relationships breaking down or surviving or thriving. And it can be the difference when we're looking at gender equality in the workplace. It's really, really vital conversation. So thank you so much for being here, dedicating time to this conversation. So I have a wonderful panel who are going to answer some questions around the research, around what they're doing in their organizations to support dads. So I'm really, really excited to get into some of these questions. So the first question I have to Martin, to Tony, to Mike, and to Jasmine is all about the fatherhood forfeit. So have you seen the fatherhood forfeit play out in your organizations? And if so, what is your advice for how you counter that? So Mike, I'm going to come to you first. What are your thoughts on that, Mike?
Hi, thanks, Elliott. Thanks, Jane, for having us on today. I'm the managing director for SF Recruitment, and one of our other businesses, SF Technology. And we have been a recruitment business for over 20 years, and we recruit in the professional services side of roles. So anything in finance, accountancy, procurement, HR, technology, digital. So it's a commercial business that predominantly was created and driven to create profit, and we still operate as a business to create profit. But we, before the pandemic, and then it's been accelerated since the pandemic, wanted to have a purpose as well, wanted to provide an environment that people can build long-term careers in recruitment by offering a better service to our clients and our candidates. And part of that as a whole, we've picked up a lot around flexibility. And the reason that we're sponsoring Working Families is that it ties very nicely into how we operate as a business. And I'll talk you through some of the details in a while. And I guess why am I here today talking about the fatherhood forfeit? Well, I'm a dad of three. I've got a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And have we ever experienced it, Elliott? I mean, yes, absolutely. So 11, 12 years ago, so my 10-year-old's nearly 11, as my wife was pregnant with Jacob, recruitment as a whole, as an industry, was very, very different to how it is now. If you left the office before 7 o'clock any day, it wasn't even the managers that would give you grief. The whole team would give you grief, but it was in the office at 8, you worked till 7, and quite often a lot later than that. And when I first started asking, even just for time off to go and have appointments to go to scans, it was almost, well, why do you need to go? Is there a problem? Is something wrong? So right from the beginning, I felt quite a big challenge. And And I guess at the time, I was already managing several teams. I was performing well, felt that I could challenge that. But that took quite a bit of courage at the time, because it was really pushing back on, I'm going to go and do this. And if you don't want me to go and do it, then you have to think about if this is the place for me to be. So I remember some really, really tough conversations. So it wasn't just comments, Jasmine, and kind of notes. It was full on, you don't need to go and do that because your wife can handle that and she can look after it, or she can pick it up. And my wife works full time as well and has a very good career. So from the off, I was determined to make changes for myself as I picked up more teams and progressed through to being the managing director. At the time, we had 2 weeks paternity pay, unpaid, statutory kind of claim back. And I worked every single day of that as well. So there was always calls I had to take and things that I had to get involved with. So I can remember coming back thinking that's never going to happen for any of my team dads. And since then, we've started to put improvements in, and that's really helped us. But around everybody within the business, so mothers, fathers, the whole piece. So we have experienced it. I would like to think we've removed that now. Some of the things, like if the children are sick, Jasmine, you mentioned before as well, if you were the one to go and pick them up, it's like, well, why can't your wife go and do it? So almost her career was the one that should give up some time, and the dad's secondary as the carers. And just to be kind of right on point and topical, my 6-year-old was poorly yesterday and had to go and get picked up. So my wife's away with work. So I kind of said, I'm going to have to finish up and leave. It was about 4 o'clock yesterday. We're doing a couple of things with the team. Not a comment is made. And in fact, this morning when I walked back in, they were like, what are you doing here? I thought you were looking after Harry. So, it was really, really positive to see a complete shift and change from where we've been. And how do we kind of counter that? We've put some policies in place. So we now pay 4 weeks full pay paternity. We pay 6 months full pay for maternity. So it's better than it was, but it's still got a long way to go to equal things out, which is something I'd like to see happen fairly soon as well. We've taken out working hours now. So people work the hours as and when they need to do, as long as the quality there and the delivery. And then we have a real flexible approach about how everybody does the job. We found out, and this helped accelerate a lot of that in the pandemic, we could work a lot more flexibly than we thought we could. We thought as recruiters we needed to be, around and be seen and be talking to each other and collaborating, but we don't need to do that face-to-face. We need to do it some of the time, but not all of the time. So we've taken some quite bold steps within our industry, let alone within our business, and our productivity and profit has increased, as well as the well-being for all the staff that we've got. So you can have profit and a purpose and still create an environment that mothers, fathers, caregivers can thrive in as well. And Jasmine, it'd be interesting to see what you're saying about the equalising the gender pay gap on your studies, because we've got a 0 gender pay gap, but it's not about trying to reduce down what men might earn to make that more comparable to what females earn. For us, we want everybody to have the opportunity to be extremely successful and earn more. So having no set hours, having the flexibility, having that culture has allowed people to do what they need to do on the care side as well, be involved, go to everything they want to go to, take the kids to school, pick them up, go to the sports days, go to the shows, be there when they're not well as well. And for us, it's created a really mature, supportive in all ways, from colleagues, from management, from directors as well, environment. And that, I think, has added into, kind of success that we've not seen for before. So, and we've counted with the policies that we've put in, but the big thing that's made the big difference is we live it. So it's all the parents, we encourage them. We've got 2 dads to be. One is expecting, his wife's expecting next week, and one in a few months. And, I'm like, look, go for the scans, but don't just go for the scan. Go for breakfast beforehand, go for lunch afterwards, go and just have the day, because it's such a special time and you won't get this time back again. It's us looking after our children, but doing it with a smile. And it's not alone. It's, like going to pick up Harry yesterday. I loved it that I was the first to go and pick him up from the childminders and get him and take him back. And okay, I missed a few calls and a few emails, but I caught up on that this morning. So, you know.
No, that's great to hear, Mike. I think it's really heartwarming to hear like the progression that's been made there. And I think the important point that you made there as well is that your business outcomes have improved as well. And, you know, this work is obviously the moral case for it and what we do for our people, but also importantly for our business as well. This is good for business. So that's amazing. We're going to get into a little bit more of that as well. Thank you, Mike. I want to give the same question over to Tony. So in the British Army, this is going to be interesting to hear in the context of the Army. How have you found, you know, has a fatherhood forfeit existed, and how have you counteracted that in your workplace?
Yeah, thanks very much, Elliott. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Just please shout if you can't. Does it exist, the fatherhood forfeit? Absolutely, it exists. I think it would be hard to find an organisation where it doesn't exist, actually. You know, there are issues with fathers asking to take time off to look after their children, often met with a response of, as we've just heard there from Mike, why can't your wife or your partner do this? Not really considering that it's something that you would want to do rather than it's a burden placed upon you. I mean, why wouldn't you want to go to your child's parents' evening, or see them playing, you know, their sports day, or see them in a sports fixture at school? As you said there, Elliott, you don't get this time back. So why wouldn't you want to do these things? A little bit about me. I joined the Army 26 years ago as a private soldier. So I joined at the bottom. I had a young family. I was 18 at that point. I joined very shortly afterwards. I had a young family. So I was a private soldier approaching Lance Corporal. So my first promotion, my first step on that ladder with a young family. And then I had another child, or we had another child 2 years after that. So I was very junior on the ladder with a very young family, and very much my day-to-day existence was not in my hands. You know, and we're talking sort of late 90s, early 2000s. And overwhelmingly then, and I think to a lesser extent now, that issue, that view of why not your partner, why not your wife, how come it's landing at your feet, that was held by the middle management. So at the very highest level, you would hear, and you do still hear that now, I want you to be spending time with your family. Family is important. You don't get this time back. The stop was coming in at the middle management level, where they were probably relying on the experiences that they had when they were junior, and maybe they had a young family, and their middle managers were saying, well, you know, that's something that your wife does, or your partner. This isn't your business. You're here to work. And that's from an organisation that has outputs, of course, but doesn't have a profit to make. So you think, what's driving that? You know, that middle manager has demands placed upon them, but there are, within the military, there are points where that demand is, you know, the sacrifices you have to make come above all else. And there are other points where family life takes a precedence. Otherwise we burn out, and we would certainly lose people within our organisation, I suppose. So what am I saying there? Our youngest people are the ones that are most affected by this, I would say. And our vital ground is to change the mindset of those middle managers, because I think at the highest level, we've absolutely got that. But it's, you know, by its nature, the Army is a hierarchical organisation. You know, we've got many more middle managers than we've got our senior leadership. And you can, so therefore you can see the tension between low numbers of senior people exhibiting positive behaviours and saying the right things, and higher numbers of middle managers doing what they've always done and what they've always seen. And so how do we change that? We're a large organisation, very large organisation. It takes time to turn that tanker around, I think, and it's worth acknowledging that things don't change overnight. But the Army is getting better. There's no silver bullet. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes resource, it takes persistent engagement with the issues to change the culture of the organisation. And that's what we're talking about here. It's cultural change. What is being done can't be done because it has always been that way. It's about shifting mindsets. And again, there's no single way to do that. It requires a multi pronged approach to that. Above all else, what is the one thing that we have to rely on, and thankfully we do have an abundance of it in the army, is good leadership, because good leadership drives change. And if you're exhibiting those behaviours at the top, and you've got that buy-in from the top that understands that importance, and not only understands it, but demonstrates it in their actions. So senior leadership, sharing stories of them with their family, taking time off, seeing them leaving the office early, despite all of the pressures that they're under, showing that they are prioritising their families at appropriate points. That positive reinforcement is absolutely what we need to rely upon. So really, I suppose, to wrap it all up, do we experience it in Fatherhood Forfeit in the organisation? Yes, and I think we will continue to do so, but we are getting after it and we're getting better. And the most important thing that we have that gets after it is good leadership, and we need to continue that.
Yeah, well said there, Tony. I think, when I work with organisations, it's always the leadership. It starts from the top, and having visible role models is so powerful. It sets the tone for the rest of the organisation. So thank you, Tony. That's fascinating. Martin's joining us from Australia, American Express. We'd be really privileged to hear your views on this. In your organisation, do you experience a fatherhood forfeit, and how do you go about countering it?
Thank you. Yes, that's a very good discussion and really helpful thoughts and insights into this topic. There are multiple dimensions of this fatherhood forfeit. I'll take them one by one. In American Express, fathers are as likely as mothers to obtain roles that allows them to combine caregiving and work. We are able to provide that flexibility, open-minded about the situations. And I think that overall, we have the right policies and tools and controls to support that. Number two, fathers are considered equal in their role as mothers, and there's no automatic assumptions that certain roles are better suited for one or the other. Number three, caregiving fathers receive the same support as caregiving mothers. And number four, fathers are not facing any social mistreatment or any comments. We have very strong trainings and a culture that supports that equality. So in summary, I think that this is not observed in the organization because of the tools, procedures, and culture that we have in place.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much. I'm just going to pass on to Jasmine for your reflections, obviously from your research and what you've heard from Martin, Tony, and Mike. Is there anything there that really stands out to you, Jasmine?
Kind of how good it is. I think there's been so much progress in this area. I think that's brilliant that these organisations here today have made such strides in this area, and I think it's really, really important. Naturally, I think because we're all on this call, we all care about this topic. So I think it's kind of I'm glad that you have that view, and I think that's important. It's how we kind of almost model what you're doing and how we can share that to other organisations. And I think events such as this are key for you to share your learnings of what you've done and how it's worked, particularly around the importance of sort of education of your teams. Quite often people in organisations don't understand that this is an issue. They don't understand that the comments that they make can actually affect people's behaviours and how the extent that they're able to be involved in their families. And also the importance of organisational role modelling. You all kind of mentioned that in different ways. And I think that's so kind of important that actually if that people in the senior organisation and the middle management, if they're going to pick up their child, that they say, I'm going to pick up my child and I'm going to make up the hours later, whatever that might be, but that they don't kind of leave a coffee cup on the desk, or they don't sort of say, I'm just popping to the shops to get some milk, when they're not, they're going to pick their child up. And in so many ways, I think so many organisations have moved so far from that. but so many organisations haven't. And certainly I was talking to some managers last week, and there were so many examples and that are still happening, demonstrating that this still is an issue for lots of organisations, but that it's really critical to educate and to share the stories. And I think sharing some of the stories like we have today from your own experience has been really useful to understand how it's impacted people in a negative way, but also in a positive way, and how when you've made the changes, how it's made you feel.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. And I think it's really important from this conversation to get some actionable takeaways. And I think from your research and from the conversation we've had, there's some real tangible things that we can think about going away and implementing in our own organizations. I want to move the conversation on to the future. The pandemic was a crazy experience for all of us, and I think it fundamentally changed the expectations from working dads and families. Society and family is fundamentally changing, and it's about organizations kind of keeping up and driving that. And I want to ask, what do you think that means for recruitment, for retention, for engagement in terms of fathers and families in the workplace? What does the future look like in the next 5 to 10 years? And how do you kind of prepare for that? So Mike, what do you think about that question?
It was a question for us that we're, I suppose, asking and answering every single day with our clients. So we're recruiting ourselves, and we've doubled the size of the business since January 21 for people to work for us. And then across the business, we're probably placing 300 people a month into roles and opportunities for them. The pandemic was horrific, and nobody wants to repeat that, but I think has been the catalyst for a lot of change for good around flexibility and around allowing fathers who, I think Tony said, want to do more for the family and for their children, to be able to say, this is how I'm doing and this is what I will do going forward. I think, we all spent a lot more time with our families over that period as well. So you got to enjoy a lot more and see a lot more. So for us now going forward, it's not something that would be nice for a father to have, is some flexibility and some time working from home and some time with the family. It's non-negotiable. This is what I do, and so I need to find a role that fits around that. So with a lot of our clients, we try and lead from the front with our ways of doing things. So taking out the working hours and the flexibility and expectation, and almost not even I'll make the hours up later. So if you need to go and do something, go and do something. It's cool, no problem at all. We've got a chap that's just been with us a few weeks, and he's got an appointment at the school in a couple of weeks, and he just told me about it, and it's about the third thing he's told me. He said, you don't need to know this, do you? And it's just, he's come from an environment where everything had to be almost listed out as to what he was doing all day, and that's quite a senior hire as well. So now people have had to think about, how do we structure our whole business to attract and recruit the right people? So how can we structure the job description so it can work around people with a bit more flexibility? There's roles where you can't do that. There's certain roles where it is rigid, and that is what the job is. So that has to be understood and taken. And there's some parts of professional services jobs that might be rigid, and you have to be present and you have to be there to deliver it as well. But there's a lot of flex in other areas that can be, and most of the roles we recruit into can have flexibility. So there's a lot more thinking that goes into it. And then how you attract people. I think, Jasmine, you mentioned this at the beginning. Just 3 months ago, we started most of the roles that we recruit have got some hybrid in there. That's one of the things that we're doing with our clients, and flexibility. So we started making that the prominent piece on every advert that we did, hybrid, flexible, part-time jobs straight away before even the content. And I know Working Families have got some great stats from other businesses that have done really well around this. I think Zurich being one of them. But for us, we've already seen applications up 30%. And since we've been doing it across the divisions that I look after and the business I look after, our placements are up 10% already. So we haven't yet run the stats properly to say it's directly from those applicants to say that's what it's done, but it's certainly created a better applicant kind of flow of people that are applying for roles as well. And for us as a business and for our clients, it's not cost us or our clients a penny. It's just how the advert is written and put out, that was going to be written and put out anyway. So that cost is already covered and absorbed. And job boards don't charge us any more for saying it's flexible than not saying it's flexible. So there's lots to think about and plan. But along with our business and lots of the business that we're working with as well, you can figure out how to do the job properly, and then get the right people. How you do it, how you attract them, how you look, how you position it, it's all a bit different, but it's been brilliant, and it's been a journey, and it's still every day I'm asked that question.
Yeah. Cheers, Mike. Tony, what about you? The future and British Army. What's in the planning for you?
No, thanks very much. Yeah. So fundamental shift into expectations. I'll start with that. Absolutely, pandemic forced the army to embrace new ways of working. So working from home where possible, working irregular hours that suit the individual and the family. Making sure we're output based rather than just being seen are all really positive things. Policy changes like flexible working, where people can dial up or dial down the level of service or the level of separation that they receive in exchange for less pay or less favourable conditions of service, to make sure that they can meet those needs, are all positive things that have come in, and on the whole most of those have been through the pandemic. What do we see moving forward? Well, there are large parts of the army that can't access for that sort of different ways of accessing the offer in terms of smarter ways of working, just because of what we do. Maybe it's resources, maybe it's the type of role they're in, maybe it's short notice activity that we may be involved with, think of floods, that sort of thing, where we just have to go and off we go, and you're off the grid. Those people that don't tend to be able to access that offer are, again, that younger cohort. So that's an area that we're really focusing on. I'd say in the next 5 to 10 years, we've left behind Afghanistan, we've left behind Iraq. We've been focusing more recently on UK resilience, and I'm talking about those floods or covering for strikes where they're necessary. Think in the pandemic, the sort of things that we were doing there, helping out in hospitals, etc. But I think Russia has shown that we can't just rest on our laurels and maybe think that that's where our future role is. So in the next 5 to 10 years, I think you'll see the military stepping up their training towards being able to move and react to those sort of threats that we're seeing Russia pose at the moment. What does that mean for our people? It means they're going to be deployed more, I would suspect, if that were the case, on a persistent basis as well. What does that mean for recruitment, retention, and the fatherhood forfeit? Well, we tend to focus our recruitment on young people that don't tend to have families. So I don't see it necessarily impacting on our recruitment, but of course those young people very soon get into relationships, have partners, have families. And so it's more about the retention of those people. And so we are already starting to look at, okay, if that's what the future of conflict may look like, how do our policies need to be bent and shaped to support a family that has a service person serving away? And by default for us, that start point for the policy is the father, because overwhelmingly that's who we employ, and it's from that we then generate our wider policy and go, okay, what are the different types of construct of a family and how do we support those? So families that aren't in a sort of 2.4 children, if you like. So absolutely, we are having to look at this, and 10 years is quite far out, but it's something that we are trying to look at, and understanding how those policies and the conditions of service that we offer, because it's seen as a whole offer. Some are financial, some are non-financial conditions of service. How do we make that offer appealing to people in an environment where they may find that their service person is going to be, or the father is going to be away more often?
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. I think that point around younger dads and parents to be, they're coming into the workplace with completely different expectations. And I do think in 5 to 10 years they start to become parents, and their expectations of the culture and the policies are going to be different to my generation. I think it is business critical that organizations start to think about this now, to keep the best talent, to recruit the best talent as well. We're going to get to some of the questions. There's some amazing questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask the panel for some quick fire answers. So let's get through a couple of these questions. So Jasmine, I'm going to come to you for the first question, which is from Aaron. And Aaron has asked, how do we start to change the culture around sharing parental responsibility? So Jasmine, and then we'll go over to Martin for the same question.
to actually talk to your teams, talk to your staff and find out what staff actually want and try to understand that. So trying to normalise those conversations to make them a little bit more standard. I think sometimes some of the difficulty during the pandemic is we saw with the recent CIPD report that came out last month that actually lots and lots of people have started using working from home as a flexible working arrangement, which has been really helpful for some people. However, that the other flexible working arrangements haven't really increased in the same way. So to have discussions with your staff to actually see what ideally would work for them, what is it that they would make things more suitable for them working environment so that you can understand that. And also to change the culture more generally, I think it's really important to tackle the microaggressions. So when you do hear these little sort of banter jokes, when you hear some negative comments, to tackle them directly, kind of why you shouldn't say that, how that makes people feel, and actually kind of trying to make the conversation more positive. Or when someone has a baby, to have a discussion with the dads in the same way as you with the mums. What are your plans when you're going to go back to work? What are your arrangements? How are you going to juggle it? Not just kind of keep those questions as something that you ask mums who have come back from maternity leave, but when a dad in your office has had a baby as well. Ask them what their intentions are and make that part of your everyday discourse that you're having that dialogue.
Thank you, Jasmine. Martin, your thoughts?
Yeah, very good question. There are three things I think that come in mind. First, we need to have the right policies, and with that training, so people understand the policies that we have in place. Number two, we need to have the right controls and measurements of that we are performing well versus the KPI that we have set internally. And number three, most importantly, we need to have the right role models, people that everybody can look up to at any level of the hierarchical organization, that will demonstrate the right behaviors, and then will be look to replicate these behaviors within their teams.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question from the Q&A. And I'm going to kind of go back to the pandemic on this one. So Ian, hi Ian. Ian's asked a question around how do we think attitudes towards male caregiving has or hasn't shifted since the pandemic. Now, we've spoken around how the pandemic, I think, has had a big influence, but we're still seeing, as we've spoken about, some of those traditional old school views and perspectives coming out. So how can we kind of harness the positive things from the pandemic and make sure that's integrated further into our work? So Tony and then Mike. So Tony, any views on that question?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, so again, this goes back to culture, and so yeah, there are absolutely positive lessons that can be learned. That the way that we can work flexibly. We've proven that we can do it, and for the army that was a really big hurdle because there were people just saying it just doesn't work for us, and in some areas it doesn't. I've said that, but actually with a little bit of thought and a bit of innovation, you can make things work. So I'd say networks have been a really big thing for us. So making sure serving parent networks, so you've got that support from each other. That's something that's come on leaps and bounds since the pandemic, making sure that, the network has a lead that has a link into the policy owner or the bullying and helpline, bullying and harassment line area of things, so that they can solve issues at short notice. I think that's been a positive from the pandemic. But again, is this from the pandemic? Probably not. But to change that culture, it's from the top down. It's about leadership, it's about education, it's about positive behaviours and reinforcement, and it's about the supporting policies that underpin that to make sure that it can be accessed by all, I think.
Yeah, well said, Tony. Mike, your views. How do we harness this momentum and make sure we continue in the future?
The pandemic definitely shifted attitudes completely. I think just, especially people were seeing into people's homes on a daily basis, and they were seeing real life as well. And especially, as a kind of working parent through the pandemic, the kids are in the house, both me and my wife are working. So there were regular intervals where some of my clients got to know my children quite well, because they'd be walking into the room and asking for chocolate or food or drinks, or I've done my work, what am I doing now? Can I go on my iPad? So I really think that, as some of the positives that came out about it were we were going so far down these routes in business where everybody was almost competing against each other, even clients and people providing services for others. And it just brought everybody back down to ground. We're all just humans trying to live our lives and do the best that we can do. And we all want to do a good job. And with that, a big part of that was dads are dads. And so they should be part of their kids' lives and they should be involved with it. And what the big thing that's happened is it's stuck. And that's what we need to do to keep it going forward as well. We need to protect that now. We need to make sure we don't move back to the times that we used to go back to. We get everyone in the office just a couple of times a week. So we're adamant that we're not going to go back to 5 days a week. And it's not even for full days then, but it's like we still like the face-to-face collaboration, still think it's important. You've got others then that come in the office 5 days a week because they like the office being their work environment and home to be their home environment. So for now, it is just making sure that these are set policies, and that's what we've done. We've made them proper, true policies. We've made it a commitment to take working hours out. You know, we have put it into the actual contracts and what we're doing to make sure that it sticks and it doesn't change on a whim, or it doesn't change maybe if the market gets a bit tougher, and then we don't want to have to revert back to that type. It can't get tougher than the pandemic. So we know that we survived and actually came out of that thriving. So we just want to make sure that it's all kept as it is. And then, you know, for us, we have clients who will come to us and ask us how we're doing it and replicating how we're doing things as well, which is great for us, because as recruiters, you don't want to just be there on a transactional basis to go and find one person for somebody. You want to be embedded in the business, helping them with their thought leadership, helping them with their retention, helping them with how to retain people as well as recruit. And those are the better relationships that, you know, work from a value perspective, but also commercially in the end as well. So it is just about embedding what we've got now and then making sure we don't revert.
Well, thank you so much. There were so many questions that came in. This is a fascinating conversation. I'm sure we could talk all day if we had the time, but unfortunately we don't. But I want to thank you for the conversation. It's been amazing. I'm going to hand back to Jane for some final words before we close.
Hi, everybody. No words of wisdom from me, just wow, what an amazing conversation, and how far have we all come since the 1970s when some dads were spending on average 15 minutes a day with their children. And I know it made so many men unhappy. So it's absolutely fantastic to see the changes that have happened. Special thanks to the panel for their insights, to Elliott for moderating so brilliantly as he always does, and to Jasmine for sharing her research with us. At Working Families, we've been around helping employers build flexible, family-friendly workplaces for over 40 years. So I think some of us as children experienced that 15 minutes a day with their dads, and some of us have experienced over time working with and being associated with and having relationships with amazing men who've just wanted to really share caregiving with their partners. So just to say, our top employers benchmark of 2023 is just reopened for new entries. Really useful tool. Please get involved in that. But finally, and most importantly, we hope that today's session has given you some useful takeaways to help your own staff find a balance that will enable them to thrive at work and at home. And from the whole team here at Working Families, we wish you a happy National Work-Life Week. So thank you so much, Elliott, Mike, Tony, Martin, and Jasmine. It's been absolutely brilliant listening to the conversation that you've been having today. Thanks very much indeed, everybody, and we hope to see you soon.